Units began firing at the approaching cavalry. The hussars, suddenly taking fire from their own side, scattered in confusion. Some fired back, not realizing they were shooting at fellow Habsburg soldiers. The officers with them tried to restore order, but their Hungarian commands were incomprehensible to the German and Slavic units doing the firing. Within minutes, the entire camp was descending into chaos. Units were firing in all directions, hitting friend and foe alike. Except there were no foes, only friends mistaken for enemies in the darkness. Officers rode through the chaos trying to restore order, but in the dark, many were shot by their own nervous men who mistook them for Ottoman cavalry. The confusion was compounded by the army's own diversity. Soldiers shouting in Serbian were mistaken for Ottomans by Croatian units. Italian commands were misinterpreted as enemy signals. Hungarian cavalry were fired upon by Austrian infantry who couldn't distinguish uniforms in the darkness and relied on language to identify friend from foe. And then Emperor Joseph II himself, who was present with the army, inadvertently made everything worse. The emperor, awakened by the chaos and trying to assess what was happening, rode toward the center of the confusion. His officers, attempting to restore order, began shouting commands in German. Halt, meaning stop. But to the many soldiers who didn't speak German well, especially those in rear units who couldn't see what was happening in the front, the word halt sounded like something else entirely. In the darkness and panic, they heard Allah, the battle cry of Ottoman forces. The psychological effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Rear units, now convinced that Ottoman troops had infiltrated the camp, began a panicked retreat. This retreat triggered a domino effect. Units seeing others fleeing assumed the battle was lost and joined the flight. The entire army began to collapse. Artillery crews, unable to see targets but hearing the chaos and believing they were under attack, began firing cannons into the darkness. The shots landed among Habsburg troops, killing and wounding hundreds. The explosions and fire only increased the panic, creating a feedback loop of terror. Cavalry units, trying to either restore order or escape the chaos, charged through infantry formations, trampling their own comrades. Supply wagons were overturned in the rush to retreat. Soldiers threw away weapons and equipment to run faster. Officers who tried to stand and rally their men were ignored or shot by panicked troops who saw authority figures as just more sources of confusing orders. The Timis River, which the army had crossed hours earlier, became a death trap. Hundreds of soldiers, fleeing in blind panic, plunged into the water in the darkness. Many drowned, weighed down by equipment or trampled by those behind them. Bodies piled up at the river crossing as the rout continued. For hours, the chaos continued. Units fired on each other, cavalry charged through friendly formations, artillery shelled what they thought were enemy positions but were actually their own troops. The night became a hell's cape of confusion, friendly fire, and mass panic. And through it all, not a single Ottoman soldier was present. When dawn finally broke over Karansebes, the full scale of the catastrophe became clear. The Habsburg camp was destroyed, tents burned, supply wagons overturned, equipment scattered across miles of terrain. Bodies lay everywhere, soldiers killed by gunfire, artillery, trampling, or drowning. Hundreds more were wounded, many severely. The survivors were scattered. Some had fled miles from the original camp. Others wandered the area in small groups, dazed and confused. Unit cohesion had completely broken down. Regiments were mixed together. Officers had lost track of their men, and the chain of command had dissolved. Conservative estimates placed the casualties at over 1,000 dead, with several thousand more wounded or missing. Some accounts suggest the numbers were even higher. But even the conservative figures represented a significant loss, an entire brigade's worth of soldiers lost to friendly fire and panic. Emperor Joseph II, humiliated and shocked, attempted to restore order and regroup the army. But it took days to reassemble the scattered units, treat the wounded, and account for the missing. The emperor ordered a complete news blackout about the incident, instructing officers to report only that there had been confusion during a night encounter with Ottoman scouts. But the truth couldn't be suppressed entirely. Soldiers talked. Letters reached home. Word spread through the ranks and eventually to other armies. The story of the army that had destroyed itself became a source of dark humor and serious concern throughout European military circles. And then the Ottomans arrived. 2 days after the incident, actual Ottoman forces reached Karansebes. They found the Habsburg camp abandoned, the fortifications destroyed, and clear evidence of a recent battle. Confused about what had happened, but recognizing an opportunity, they occupied the area and took the supplies and equipment the Habsburgs had left behind. The Ottoman commanders were baffled. They had achieved a significant victory without fighting a battle. Intelligence reports couldn't explain what had happened. Had the Habsburgs been ambushed by a different Ottoman force? Had they suffered an epidemic? Had they received orders to withdraw? It would be years before the Ottomans learned the truth, that the Habsburg army had simply destroyed itself. The Battle of Karansebes, as it came to be known, had immediate and long-lasting consequences. The Austro-Turkish War, already going poorly for the Habsburgs, deteriorated further. The loss of men, equipment, and, most importantly, morale dealt a significant blow to the campaign. Emperor Joseph II's reputation suffered. His ambitious reforms and military campaigns were already controversial. The disaster at Karansebes gave his critics powerful ammunition. The emperor became increasingly ill over the following years, and when he died in 1790, many attributed his decline partly to the stress and humiliation of the war's failures. For the Habsburg military, the incident prompted serious reforms. Language standardization became a priority. Efforts were made to ensure that at least officers could communicate in German across all units. Training emphasized identification and communication protocols during night operations. The multinational nature of the army, long seen as a strength, was recognized as a potential vulnerability that needed to be managed. But beyond the immediate military and political consequences, the Battle of Karansebes became something else, a cautionary tale, a dark comedy, and a historical mystery all wrapped into one. The incident raises profound questions about the nature of warfare and human psychology. How could professional soldiers, trained and experienced, descend into such complete chaos so quickly? The answer lies in the complex interaction of factors that created a perfect storm of confusion. First, there was the linguistic and cultural fragmentation. The Habsburg army wasn't just multilingual, it was multi-ethnic, with units that harbored historical grudges and suspicions toward each other. In the stress of combat, these underlying tensions surfaced catastrophically. Second, there was the environmental factor. Darkness is a powerful amplifier of confusion and fear. Visual identification was impossible, forcing soldiers to rely on sound. And in a multilingual army, sound became a source of confusion rather than clarity. Third, there was the psychological element. Soldiers were exhausted, on edge, and primed to expect an Ottoman attack. In such a state, the human mind tends toward threat interpretation. Ambiguous information is processed as danger. Once a few soldiers believed they were under attack, that belief spread like wildfire through a population already primed for it. Fourth, there was the cascade effect. Each reaction to the initial confusion made the situation worse, creating a feedback loop that rapidly spiraled out of control. Panic is contagious, and in the confined space of a military camp, it spread with devastating speed. Finally, there was the failure of command and control. Officers couldn't communicate effectively with their men, couldn't see what was happening, and couldn't restore order once it broke down. Authority dissolved in the face of mass panic. The question that haunts historians is, did it actually happen? The Battle of Karansebes is one of the most controversial events in military history. Contemporary records are frustratingly sparse. Emperor Joseph II's news blackout was partially effective, and official military records from the period either don't mention the incident or describe only a confused night engagement. Most of what we know comes from later accounts, memoirs written years after the event, and secondhand reports. Some historians argue the incident has been exaggerated over time, that perhaps a relatively minor friendly fire incident was blown up into legendary proportions through repeated telling. Others point out that the sheer embarrassment of the event would naturally lead to official suppression and that the absence of contemporary records might actually support the story's authenticity. Authorities would have been desperate to hide such a humiliating disaster. What's certain is that something happened at Karansebes in September 1788. The Habsburg army definitely suffered casualties and retreated from the area without engaging Ottoman forces. Whether the incident was as catastrophic as legend suggests remains debated, but even a less extreme version of events would still represent an extraordinary military disaster. Regardless of the exact details, the Battle of Karansebes offers enduring lessons for military organizations and any complex system where communication and coordination are critical. The incident demonstrates the vulnerability of large, diverse organizations to cascade failures. One small problem, a dispute over alcohol, triggered a chain reaction that destroyed an entire army's cohesion. This principle applies far beyond military contexts. In any system with multiple interconnected components, small failures can cascade into catastrophic breakdowns if proper safeguards aren't in place. It highlights the critical importance of clear communication, especially in stressful situations. The linguistic diversity that made the Habsburg army a symbol of imperial unity became a fatal vulnerability when rapid, unambiguous communication became necessary. Modern militaries invest heavily in communication protocols, standardized terminology, and language training specifically to avoid such breakdowns. The battle illustrates how human psychology can override training and discipline under certain conditions. These were professional soldiers, not inexperienced recruits, yet they descended into panic and fratricidal combat. Understanding the psychological factors that trigger such breakdowns remains a key concern for military psychologists and leadership training. It demonstrates the danger of confirmation bias in crisis situations. Once soldiers believed they were under attack, every piece of ambiguous information, gunfire, shouting, movement in the darkness, was interpreted as confirming that belief. This cognitive trap affected everyone from enlisted men to officers to the emperor himself. Finally, it serves as a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is disorder itself. The Ottomans didn't need to destroy the Habsburg army at Karansebes. The army did that to itself. In warfare, as in any complex endeavor, maintaining internal cohesion and preventing self-inflicted damage can be as important as defeating external enemies. Today, the town of Karansebes in Romania sits quietly in the Timis Valley, its streets peaceful and its history largely forgotten by those who live there. Few physical remnants of the 1788 disaster remain. No monuments mark the spot where thousands of Habsburg soldiers shot each other in the darkness. But the battle lives on in historical memory, taught in military academies as a case study in catastrophic failure, referenced in discussions of organizational breakdown, and retold as one of history's most bizarre military disasters. It has become a symbol of how even the most powerful and well-equipped forces can be undone by confusion, miscommunication, and panic. The Habsburg Empire itself would survive for another century and a half, finally dissolving in 1918 at the end of World War I. But the fundamental problem exposed at Karansebes, how to maintain unity and effectiveness across a diverse, multinational empire, would plague the Habsburgs until their end. In the aftermath of the disaster, as the scattered remnants of the army slowly regrouped, Emperor Joseph II sat in his tent, facing the reality of what had occurred. Officers stood awkwardly, awaiting orders, instructions, some explanation of how to proceed after such an inexplicable catastrophe. The emperor was silent for a long time, staring at maps that had become meaningless. All the careful planning, all the strategic considerations, all the diplomatic maneuvering that had led to this campaign, none of it had prepared him for the possibility that his own army would simply destroy itself. Finally, one of his senior commanders spoke, his voice hesitant. "Your Majesty, how do we report this?" Joseph looked up, his face drawn with exhaustion and humiliation. "Report what, General? That we fired upon ourselves in the darkness? That thousands of our men died because they couldn't understand each other? That the enemy won a great victory simply by not being there?" The officers said nothing. "We report," the emperor continued, his voice hollow, that there was confusion during a night encounter. We acknowledge losses. We regroup and continue the campaign. And we pray that future historians are kind enough to think we were simply incompetent rather than whatever this was. One of the younger officers, still shaken by what he'd witnessed, ventured a question. "Your Majesty, what happened? How did this happen?" The emperor stood and walked to the tent opening, looking out at the dawn light over the scattered camp. "We brought together an empire's worth of people and assumed they would fight as one. We spoke different languages, carried different grudges, feared different things. And when darkness came and fear took hold, we forgot that we were all on the same side." He turned back to his officers. "The Ottomans didn't defeat us here. We defeated ourselves. Remember that, gentlemen. Remember it when you train your men, when you plan your campaigns, when you build your armies. The greatest threat to any force is not always the enemy across the battlefield. Sometimes it's the chaos within." The emperor's words proved prophetic. The Battle of Karansebes became a watershed moment in military thinking about organization, communication, and the psychological dimensions of warfare. It demonstrated that an army is more than just armed men. It's a complex system of communication, trust, discipline, and shared understanding that can break down catastrophically under the wrong conditions. For the soldiers who survived that terrible night, the memory lingered. Many carried physical scars, wounds inflicted not by enemy weapons, but by their own comrades' bullets and blades. But the psychological scars ran deeper. They had experienced the ultimate military nightmare, fighting desperately for survival only to discover they had been fighting themselves. Some turned their experience into grim humor, sharing dark jokes about the battle we won against ourselves. Others fell silent on the subject, unable or unwilling to explain what had happened to families and friends back home. A few became vocal advocates for military reform, using their experience as evidence that armies needed better communication, clearer identification methods, and more rigorous discipline. And in the taverns and campfires of armies across Europe, the story spread. It was told as a cautionary tale, as a dark comedy, as an impossible legend. "Did you hear?" soldiers would ask each other, "about the Austrian army that fought a battle and lost to itself?" The story seemed too absurd to be true, yet too specific to be entirely false. And so it entered the realm of historical legend, that uncertain space where truth and myth blur together, where the question, "Did this really happen?" becomes less important than what the story reveals about human nature, military organization, and the chaos that lurks beneath the surface of any complex system. 100,000 soldiers had made camp near Karansebes on a September evening in 1788. By the next morning, thousands were dead or wounded, the army was scattered, and a place name had become synonymous with catastrophic organizational failure. The Ottomans, when they finally arrived, found an abandoned battlefield and gained a victory without drawing a sword. The night an army destroyed itself became a turning point, not in the war, which the Habsburgs would eventually conclude without decisive victory, but in how military leaders thought about the hidden vulnerabilities of their forces. It proved that sometimes the most devastating defeat comes not from enemy action, but from internal breakdown. That chaos is always waiting in the wings, and that maintaining order and cohesion is perhaps the most fundamental challenge of any large organization. As the decades and centuries passed, the Battle of Karansebes faded from immediate military concern to historical curiosity. But the lessons remained relevant, applied in contexts far beyond 18th century European warfare, in disaster response, in organizational management, in any situation where diverse groups must coordinate under pressure. The river still flows past Karansebes, indifferent to the human drama that once unfolded on its banks. The fields where soldiers fired on their own comrades are now peaceful farmland. The darkness that once hid friend from foe has given way to the lights of modern civilization. But the story endures. The story of confusion and cascade failure. The story of how language barriers became battle lines. The story of the night when darkness, diversity, and disaster combined to create one of history's most bizarre military catastrophes. 100,000 strong, they made camp. By morning, they were broken, not by enemy swords or bullets, but by their own weapons, their own confusion, their own fear. No enemy needed. Just darkness, miscommunication, and the terrible realization that sometimes the greatest danger comes from within. The night was dark, dangerously dark. 100,000 soldiers of the Habsburg Empire made camp near the small town of Karansebes in what is now Romania. They had marched for days, tired but confident, part of Emperor Joseph II's grand campaign against the Ottoman Turks. Regiments from across the empire had gathered: Austrians, Hungarians, Croats, Serbs, Italians, Czechs, a polyglot force representing the vast diversity of Habsburg power. But that diversity would become their doom. Because on this September night in 1788, something extraordinary would happen. Something so bizarre, so catastrophic, so utterly absurd that historians would debate for centuries whether it actually occurred. An army would fight a battle. An army would suffer thousands of casualties. An army would be routed and forced to retreat in complete disarray. And there would be no enemy present at all. This is the story of the Battle of Karansebes. The night confusion became carnage. The night an empire's army destroyed itself. And the night that proved sometimes the most dangerous enemy is chaos itself. The Habsburg Empire in 1788 was a sprawling, multinational state that stretched from modern-day Austria through Hungary, Czech lands, parts of Poland, Italy, and the Balkans. It was powerful but deeply fragmented, a patchwork of ethnicities, languages, religions, and cultures held together by dynastic loyalty and military force. Emperor Joseph II, an ambitious reformer, had embroiled the empire in the Austro-Turkish War, a conflict that had been grinding on since 1787. The Ottomans, though past their peak, remained a formidable adversary, and the war had not gone as smoothly as Vienna had hoped. Campaigns had stalled, sieges had failed, and both sides were exhausted by the constant maneuvering. By September 1788, a massive Habsburg force was advancing through the Banat region of modern-day Romania, pursuing Ottoman forces and seeking to press the advantage before winter arrived. The army was enormous. Estimates place it at around 100,000 men and represented virtually every corner of the empire. But this diversity, which should have been a strength, carried a hidden vulnerability. The soldiers spoke dozens of different languages. German was the official language of command, but many officers and most enlisted men spoke only their native tongues: Hungarian, Croatian, Serbian, Italian, Czech, Romanian. Communication between units was difficult even in the best of circumstances. And the circumstances were about to become very far from the best. The army had been marching hard, and discipline was fraying. Soldiers were exhausted, supplies were irregular, and the constant threat of Ottoman raiders kept everyone on edge. Officers struggled to maintain order across the sprawling, multi-ethnic force. Units from different regions eyed each other with suspicion born of old rivalries and cultural misunderstandings. On the evening of September 17, 1788, the army made camp near the town of Karansebes on the Timis River. Scouts had reported Ottoman forces in the general area, though exact numbers and locations were unclear. The army was ordered to maintain high alert. Sentries were posted, patrols sent out, and officers instructed their men to be ready for a possible night attack. The stage was set, not for a battle with the Ottomans, but for something far stranger. As darkness fell over the camp, a detachment of Hussars, light cavalry scouts, mostly ethnic Hungarians, crossed the Timis River on a reconnaissance patrol. Their mission was simple: probe ahead, locate any Ottoman forces, and report back. It was routine work for experienced cavalry. On the far side of the river, the Hussars encountered a group of Romani travelers with wagons. Among their goods was a supply of alcohol, schnapps, according to most accounts. The Hussars, tired and thirsty after days of hard marching, decided this was worth investigating. They negotiated to purchase the alcohol, set up a makeshift drinking area, and began to indulge. What happened next would trigger a cascade of disasters. As the Hussars were drinking, a a group of Austrian infantry from a different regiment arrived at the river crossing. These soldiers, seeing their comrades with alcohol, demanded to share in the spoils. The Hussars, already somewhat drunk and possessive of what they'd purchased, refused. The argument escalated. Words were exchanged in Hungarian and German, languages the two groups understood imperfectly. Tempers flared. Someone shoved someone else. And then, in the darkness and confusion, a shot was fired. Nobody knows for certain who fired first, or whether it was accidental or intentional. But that single gunshot was like a spark in a powder magazine. The Hussars, trained cavalrymen in a combat zone, reacted instinctively to gunfire. They mounted their horses and began shouting warnings. But here, the fatal flaw of the multilingual army revealed itself. The Hussars shouted in Hungarian, "Turk, Turk," meaning the Turks are here. The Austrian infantry, hearing the shouting and gunfire but not understanding the Hungarian words clearly in the darkness, assumed they were under attack. They began falling back toward the river crossing, firing as they retreated. Their officers, unable to see what was happening and hearing only chaos and gunfire, assumed an Ottoman assault was underway. Panic began to spread like a contagion. Back at the main camp, units heard the gunfire from across the river and went to full alert. Officers barked orders in German, but many soldiers didn't speak German well enough to understand complex commands under stress. Drums beat the alarm. Soldiers grabbed weapons and rushed toward their assembly points in the darkness. But in the chaos and darkness, regiments became mixed together. A Croatian unit stumbled into a Serbian position. An Italian regiment found itself surrounded by Hungarian cavalry. And everywhere, men were shouting in different languages, unable to communicate, unable to understand what was happening. The Hussars came thundering back across the river, riding hard and still shouting warnings in Hungarian. To the infantry units forming up in the darkness, the sound of galloping cavalry charging toward them could only mean one thing: enemy attack.